Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jessica Reitz Curtin, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today and for making time to be part of this really important conversation. Before we begin, for those of you who may be new to Spirit of America, we are a national security nonprofit organization founded in 2003. Every day, we work with U.S. troops and diplomats to identify where America's help is needed most. We do not receive government funding. Instead, we engage citizens to deliver non-lethal assistance with flexibility and speed in support of U.S. national security objectives and to preserve the promise of a free and better life around the world. We focus on supporting our local partners on the front lines who are navigating complex dynamics all the time. Today's conversation comes at a moment of heightened global uncertainty around Iran and its actions across the Middle East. A lot of immediate attention over the last 13 days has been devoted to Iran, but many of the political and security realities of how this conflict is playing out on the ground with our partners across the Middle East has received far less attention. Our discussion today will focus on how these dynamics are evolving, what they mean for regional stability, and also for U.S. national security. We are grateful to be joined by three experts, each with decades of insights to share with us on this topic. It's my privilege to introduce them, beginning with Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Ambassador Crocker is one of the most respected American diplomats of our time. He served more than 37 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, and he's among the very few to have served 6 times as U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Lebanon, and Kuwait. His career spans the most complex chapters of U.S. engagement in the Middle East, including early experience in Iran. In 2009, Ambassador Crocker received the prestigious Presidential Medal of Freedom from President George W. Bush, and in 2012, he received the title of Honorary Marine. He also serves as a member of Spirit of America's Advisory Board. We're also pleased to be joined by Mona Yacoubian, a leading expert on Middle East conflict dynamics. Mona is Director and Senior Advisor of the Middle East Program at CSIS, focusing on conflict prevention, governance, and stabilization. Mona brings more than 3 decades of experience across government and policy research, including senior roles at USAID and the U.S. Institute of Peace. And she served as the Executive Director of the congressionally appointed Syria Study Group. She began her career as a State Department intelligence analyst, and she's a former Fulbright Scholar in Syria. Our third panelist is Mary Bell-Ruiz, Spirit of America's Regional Director for the Middle East and Central Asia. Based in Amman, she brings more than 25 years of leadership experience across defense, diplomacy, and humanitarian operations. A retired U.S. Navy intelligence leader and Arabic linguist, Mary has led crisis responses in Iraq, Jordan, and Afghanistan. Before joining Spirit of America, she founded Team Themis, a humanitarian organization supporting at-risk Afghan women and children. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. To our audience, we are going to have time at the end for Q&A, so please be sure to put any questions you have in the Q&A function, and we'll please put any questions you have in the Q&A function. And with that, I'll turn to the panelists for our first question. So Iran's current strategy in this conflict is threefold: mobilizing their proxy militias in Lebanon and Iraq, attacking military and civilian infrastructure, including energy, oil, and supply chains across the region, and creating turmoil in global markets. Ambassador Crocker, can you please talk about what we are seeing evolve in Iraq in response to this conflict, with an Iranian-supported government in Baghdad and a U.S.-backed government in Erbil?
Well, first of all, let me just say thanks for having me on this show. Jess and Mona and Mary, hi, how are you? I look forward to your wisdom. You can make up for my lack of. Well, Iraq is between a rock and a hard place right now. We saw that, I think, graphically displayed overnight with the nearly simultaneous attacks on a major pro-Iranian militia force in western Iraq. At the same time, Iranian bomb boats hit 2 tankers in Iraqi territorial waters that were loading product. So they are at both ends of this messy stick right now, and I think just trying desperately to avoid the line of fire as much as they can. I think the Kurdish region has been frankly, a force for stability in this effort by quickly and forcefully rejecting any notion that Iraqi Kurdistan would involve itself in any way in the Iranian conflict, following comments from the U.S. administration welcoming and Kurdish rising against the regime. That takes some of the heat off of Baghdad. And here again, it's important to bear one important thing in mind. Iraq is a quintessentially Arab country. They share a religious belief with a majority in both countries being Shia, but the ties of culture, of nationality, and of history are very, very strong. We can't forget that Iraq and Iran fought a vicious 8-year ground war, and Iraqi Shia soldiers died by the hundreds of thousands against an Iranian foe, fighting for their version of a unified Arab Iraqi state. So the notion of Iran controlling events totally in Iraq is and always has been far from the truth. That said, there are issues that go beyond politics here. Iraq is heavily dependent, for example, on Iranian natural gas flows. And a shutoff, there was a brief shutoff, and clearly that supply is in jeopardy the longer this conflict goes on, will have devastating effects on the Iraqi economy. So of all the players in this region, outside of the direct antagonists themselves, Iraq is probably in the most difficult position.
That's an excellent point. Mary, did you want to chime in with anything that we're hearing from our partners on the ground?
It echoes what Ambassador Crocker just said. Kurdistan has taken a very clear stance on where they are in the conflict, and they will not be participating, but that does not exempt them from suffering from its effects. Iran-aligned Iraqi militias are actively firing projectiles into northern Iraq, into Kurdistan, and we're also seeing Shahed drone attacks from Iran into northern Iraq as well, attacking the Kurds. So while they attempt to remain neutral in this, as our partners, they are suffering the effects of the conflict itself, and they're having to defend themselves accordingly. So we're in communication with them on a daily basis, and they are suffering those effects and will continue to until the conflict ends, I believe.
Yeah, and I saw that even the Baghdad Diplomatic Support Center was that many of us have flown through over the years was attacked multiple times by the militias. So yeah, okay. Let's talk a little bit about Lebanon. Mona, I think you are the best position to talk about the dynamics of what's been going on within Lebanon's borders over the past couple of months. And what we've seen since Hezbollah broke the ceasefire arrangement with the Israeli Defense Forces is a public denouncement of Hezbollah and their military action in Lebanon. So for some, this might seem like a complete 180 by the Lebanese government. Can you talk a little bit about how this is affecting their credibility? And do you see the current government and the Lebanese armed forces being able to stabilize the country, or do you think they're headed for civil war?
Big questions, Jess. Thank you. And it's really an honor to be on a panel with Ambassador Crocker and, of course, with Mary. And thank you to Spirit of America for inviting me. So I think if I could, I think it would be useful just to take a step back for a moment and situate this current, what I'm calling a second front now in the war that opened up after, as Jess, as you rightly point out, Hezbollah launched drone and rocket attacks on northern Israel. I think it was March 1st, so literally a day after this started. And it is a bit of a deja vu. It's a bit of an echo of what Hezbollah did on October 8, 2023, in which, again, as Hezbollah jumped into the fray and essentially set off a tit-for-tat escalation with the Israeli Defense Forces that ended up in a pretty significant conflict throughout 2024, leading to the decimation of Hezbollah in 2024. And I say that because I think it's important to understand where things were just prior to February 28 of this year, when, of course, this current conflict got kicked off. And in particular, I was in Lebanon, had the opportunity to travel there in December. And part of the travel was really trying to understand better a new government that had come into power as a result of Hezbollah's decimation and the opening of a new path for a reform-minded government, not beholden to Hezbollah, not having to work within a Hezbollah implicit veto, which Hezbollah has wielded for decades. And most importantly, a government that, as of September of last year, made clear its plan to disarm Hezbollah, which is actually unprecedented. And we went to try to understand how fast this disarming process was moving or not. And of course, there has been a lot of criticism in the United States, within the US government, on the Hill, and actually with the Israelis as well, that this disarmament was simply not proceeding fast enough. It wasn't serious. And I mean, I think this is something we could perhaps talk about further in the Q&A. But I say, therefore, President Allen's recent statement denouncing Hezbollah's military activities, and actually the move by the cabinet under Prime Minister Nawaf Salam to make illegal Hezbollah military activities, also to deport Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps members in Lebanon, and to institute a visa requirement for Iranians, something that had not been the case. Those three moves, I think, underscore that there has been some tentative and movement toward disarming Hezbollah. I think the challenge is it's perhaps was too little too late in terms of the fact that Hezbollah is still there. They did mount this attack. And now we're seeing, of course, a very significant conflict laying down in Lebanon today. And I think we should note the humanitarian implications of this. I believe at this point, more than 600 people have been killed, and displacement levels above 800,000, which is pretty significant. In terms of, could this, I guess that the key question really is, how realistic is it, or what are fair expectations with respect to the government's movement on disarming Hezbollah versus concerns that if they move too quickly and too aggressively, civil strife and even a civil war could be provoked in Lebanon? And I think, that is a very nuanced and difficult question. And it became even more difficult now that the country is also under the onslaught of Israeli airstrikes and even an Israeli ground incursion. And so I do think, to be fair, we have to place it all in that context. But look, we saw some not insignificant progress in disarming, which now, unfortunately, I think has stalled, to say the least. And of course, we now have the LAF and others withdrawing from southern Lebanon. I think the key question is really what are the fair expectations, and particular controversy and attention has been focused on the Chief of Defense, General Rudolf Heikel, whom many criticize for really not being willing to move more forcefully on the disarmament question. My own sense is, I think it would be useful to have a discussion about, well, what can we realistically expect the Lebanese government, and by extension, the Lebanese armed forces, to do? What would be a significant signal of their willingness to move more forcefully on disarming Hezbollah? And what happens in return for that? And so at this point, I think things are rather, chaotic on the ground. We have seen some arrests of Hezbollah members that took place over the last week. However, as with everything in Lebanon, they were also released on something like $10 bail. So, I mean, I think, bottom line, Jess, these are significant questions. They're not easily answered. And I think they are intimately linked with what's happening on the ground right now. And I guess a bigger question of what is the future? What is the future of Israel's ties to Lebanon? How realistic is it to expect full disarmament of Hezbollah, and how quickly? And again, I don't know that there are clear answers to those questions, to be very fair.
Jess, could I just interject one thing here?
Of course, Ambassador.
Yeah,
Please do.
comments on the future. If Lebanon is to have a better future vis-a-vis Hezbollah and vis-a-vis Israel, it lies in one institution, and that is the Lebanese Armed Forces, which did deploy in unprecedented strength following the last ceasefire, is now, as Mona notes, withdrawing. But for a stable Lebanon and a secure Lebanese-Israeli border, a Hezbollah that is no longer an independent militia force, this will all come down to the Lebanese army. And as Mona says, there are questions, but I wanted to note in particular Spirit of America's support for the Lebanese Armed Forces, which has been significant and long-standing. I can't imagine a better investment in a more stable regional future than what Spirit of America is doing with the Lebanese Armed Forces right now. Thanks.
Can I say one other thing too? Because I think Ambassador Crocker's very, very good comments are a reminder that I should have said at the outset, that there's really only one national institution in Lebanon that commands respect across all sects. And it really does, I think it is the glue that holds the country together, especially in times like what we are witnessing now with conflict and so forth. And so I do think having a more nuanced understanding of what can be expected under the current circumstances, and quite frankly, what kinds of support is required to help this partner, this very important partner, achieve these goals of disarming Hezbollah, understanding again that it is an extraordinarily difficult time in the country. But I would also say potentially a moment of opportunity, because I neglected to say this at the outset. Hezbollah's decision to jump in as they did on March 1st is wildly unpopular, including with the Shia community. And it is a demonstration of this militia once again usurping what we would call sovereign decisions of war and peace to the detriment of the entire country. And so we've even seen Nabi Berri, the head of Amal, the other Shia party, actually also express frustration with Hezbollah and a willingness to support these decisions of the need to disarm. And so I do think it's important to underscore that it's a moment of crisis for Lebanon, but there is also embedded in it an opportunity, but it needs to be pursued smartly and with an understanding of the sophisticated and difficult and complex circumstances on the ground. Sorry, I just realized I needed to say those things.
Oh, thanks, Mona.
I think it's important to add on to, as we talk about Lebanon, that we're looking at a significant generational change here in the region at large, but Lebanon's a big part of that. So we're seeing stability continuously in Jordan, and now we've seen a generational change in Syria for an opportunity for stability. And Lebanon was the last key piece in that. So by Iran stepping in and activating their proxy and stirring up conflict in Lebanon to the point of possibly initiating a civil war, that bolsters what Iran is trying to accomplish in the region. So as Admiral Crocker and Mona were saying, being able to support the LAF as our partner at this time is critical, because if we do not and Lebanon drops into a civil war, it will further plunge the Levant into a conflict and instability that we do not want to see.
Oh, thanks, Mary. And, a segue to that is Syria. Many of us have been watching Syria closely over the last 15 years, and it's pretty interesting to watch President Al-Shara seemingly signaling neutrality in this conflict right now. In January, he, along with U.S. and Israeli officials, announced a joint fusion center around the Golan Heights to do intelligence sharing, military de-escalation, and diplomatic engagement. And that was largely unpopular inside many communities inside Syria. But to date, we have not seen Hezbollah or Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps attacks launched from Syria into Israel. So what are your thoughts on Al-Shara's position? Is he going to be able to maintain this neutrality throughout this conflict, or what will potentially pull Syria more clearly into the conflict?
I defer to Mona on this.
I mean, I'll say a quick word, but I'm sure the ambassador and Mary both have insights to add as well. Look, Ahmed Al-Shara has proven himself to be an extraordinarily savvy and capable leader. And it does seem clear, Jess, that he is pursuing a policy of no problems with neighbors, understanding just how significant this conflict is. I will also say he has no love for the Iranians. Let's be very clear on that. And so in that regard, this is not difficult for him. On the score of the front with Israel, you're right to point out the progress that was made through the good offices of Envoy Barak, Ambassador Tom Barak, who's done quite a lot of work in shuttle diplomacy in setting up this fusion cell, which could prove extraordinarily useful in this moment where we do see conflict all over the place and all kinds of potential for unintended escalation and so forth. What worries me the most, Jess, is if Lebanon really does fall back into the abyss of widespread civil strife and even civil war. We know how intimately connected Lebanon and Syria are. And while Ahmed Al-Shara has worked hard to fortify the border, and actually there's been important rapprochement and détente between Ahmed Al-Shara and President Aoun, and sort of addressing some of the outstanding issues in the bilateral relationship. That work was happening before the outbreak of this conflict. It may well help insulate and fortify the bilateral relationship and by extension, Syria. But I think to the laydown that the ambassador gave at the outset of the difficulties Iraq faces, there are similar concerns about Syria, given its central location, the geostrategic importance that it holds, that if we are watching a region that is on fire, it is going to be very hard for this country to stay insulated. And I will say, in the midst of its own very delicate and fragile stabilization.
I would just add to that I was in both Syria and Lebanon a little bit before Mona was in October of last year, and had the opportunity to get perspectives of both governments in the lull between the two halves of this giant hurricane. Mona mentioned the role of Tom Barak, President Trump's special envoy for Syria and now for Iraq. And by all accounts, he has played a very positive role in supporting the Shara administration in its efforts to provide some form of good governance, at least better than Syria has known for the last half century, and to prevent further regional conflict. There was an episode last year in the south of Syria that pitted Bedouin Arabs against the Druze minority, in which Israel involved itself. And Barak is credited in both Syria and in Lebanon for having forcefully stepped in to back the Israelis off there. And that particular zone has remained quiet through the 10 days of this current conflict so far. But there is one missing piece here, and that is an American embassy in Damascus. After more than well over a year since the overthrow of the Assad regime, we still have not opened an embassy. We have no ambassador. We similarly have no ambassador in Baghdad. And as one who spent about 18 years as an ambassador, I can tell you that ambassadors do more than just attend tea parties. The day-to-day management of particularly of a conflict depends on your woman or man at the top. And I fear that we are losing both visibility on events as they unfold dramatically and also the ability to shape those events.
I have to tag on to what the ambassador mentioned. I just returned from Amman, Jordan, and in what is historic, Amman, Jordan is one of the most stable embassies in the world and has never ordered departure in the history of the embassy being open. And while a full order departure has not occurred, a majority of the staff has returned back here to the States. And we are seeing that ripple effect across the entire region due to the attacks from Iran on embassies across the Middle East. So just to tag on to what he's saying, we are seeing a loss of visibility due to those attacks that we're responding to keep our personnel safe, but it is affecting our visibility immensely in the region. And we're grateful to have our partners on the ground that are continuing to give us information that gives us some visibility to know what's going on in this part of the world.
Oh, thanks, Mary. Let's talk about the GCC countries a little bit. Ambassador Crocker, what has their engagement in the conflict been thus far, and what do you see as the effects on their populations and economies if the current events become a prolonged conflict for them?
Well, it's a great question because the Gulf states, unlike Iran, Israel, Lebanon, are not used to violent conflict. They have built their economies on the premise of ongoing stability, both for their crucial oil and petroleum-related exports, but also for the dazzling infrastructure they've built and the efforts they've made to turn the Arab side of the Gulf into a kind of a preferred site for international business. So we're seeing them now, of course, suffer directly through multiple Iranian attacks, and most crucially, of course, the de facto closing of the Straits of Hormuz, where 20% of the world's oil comes from, and which is the mainstay of the Gulf economies. So the longer this goes on, I think the more uncomfortable they become. But here again, Iran, in its shotgun approach to a retaliation targeting the Gulf states directly, as well as U.S. and Israeli targets, has solidified, I think, Gulf anger and resentment against Iran. We saw that most graphically, I think, just yesterday with the Security Council resolution brought by Bahrain as president of the council this month, condemning Iran for its attacks on its neighbors. And this at a time when the U.S. and Israel are engaged heavily in that conflict. There was no condemnation of the U.S. or Israel. No resolution surfaced on that. It was solely against Iran. So that kind of solidity, I think, is encouraging. But the longer this goes on, the more damage that Iran can do to the economies of the Gulf states, the tougher their position becomes. But Mona, I teed this question up for you, actually. So,
well, I think you teed it up well, because I think I would just pick up on where Ambassador Crocker left off, which is really to underscore that last point about the longer this goes on, the more, frankly, untenable the position is, I think, for Gulf countries who have staked their lot on diversifying their economies, on integrating their economies, and becoming the super connector region that they've envisioned for themselves. And I love that phrase of dazzling infrastructure. I'm going to steal it because it just says it so well. And all of it has not gone up in smoke, but what we're witnessing now is truly a nightmare for these countries. I will say, in my engagements with various interlocutors from the Gulf, I'm hearing a few interesting common themes. One is absolutely the anger at Iran for what Iran has done, this unjust retaliation when they made very clear that they would not allow attacks to be launched from their territory, and that Iran has no rationale, no reason for retaliating against these Gulf countries. That's stated very clearly. However, they also state clearly that they're not interested in joining the fight. They are not interested in joining offensive operations with the United States and, of course, by extension, Israel against Iran. And they also note, and I've heard this said almost to verbatim from folks from different countries, Iran is here to stay. Iran is in the region. Iran is our neighbor. So we have to figure this out. And that's where I think the challenge lies, is how to figure this out. And it has been noted to me that they don't believe Iran should be rewarded for, in essence, taking all of them hostage by rendering basically inoperable the Strait of Hormuz and by launching all of these attacks on their infrastructure. So how to move forward in a way that doesn't reward Iran so that it goes back and does this again, and that puts the region on a stable footing where the Gulf and, quite frankly, the rest of the Middle East can get back to what they were embarked upon, which is really a new order that would be defined by a region devoid of conflict, noted for its economic growth and integration, and playing that role of connecting the Middle East, the Middle East being the connector between Asia, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa. That's the vision. It's hard to imagine today, but I do think that the region continues to want to drive toward that.
If I can
Excellent.
here.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I think it's really important to note that we have not seen a non-reaction like this, I think, ever on the global scale with a conflict to this scale. The neutrality and the non-offensive nature that the countries who are being subject to these attacks are taking is unprecedented. So it's almost as if their focus is sovereignty and being able to come out on the other side as sovereign nations that did not involve themselves in a way and protected their visions for the future by maintaining neutrality and remaining absent from the conflict, but continuing to push forward what they believe is their goals for the future, which is a stable Middle East.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on Mona's thread too about the overall vision being for, Asia, the Middle East, into Africa. And Mary, I'd like for you to chime in here with some of the other areas where we're seeing this instability that Iran is creating playing out on the ground, and where we have concerns about potential political and/or security issues in the very near future.
It's a great question, and it's a huge problem. I'm a retired Navy intelligence and intelligence community veteran, and it has long since been the belief that should Iran feel that its authoritarian power is being challenged, that they were going to respond in this way in a regional disruption strategy. So it wasn't going to be about victory. It wasn't going to be about winning. It was going to be about creating enough instability across multiple theaters to shift the focus outward from Iran and not inward towards Tehran. So I think what we're seeing right now is in lockstep with that playbook. First off, I think they're trying to expand the global footprint of their attacks in general. It isn't just responding to U.S. military targets in the region. It is to civilian infrastructure across the Middle East. It is expanding outside the Middle East to Azerbaijan, to Turkey. There have been launches against both of those countries. So when they continue to push that footprint out, it continues to push the attention away from themselves and sow instability elsewhere. And I think that's why we're seeing that non-response from the GCC as they try to remain out of that. We were seeing it on the ground in Amman. Amman, who is typically not involved in these tit-for-tat between Iran and Israel specifically, is being subject to daily drone and missile interceptions, thankfully. None have actually caused deaths in Jordan. I live there, so of course I have a vested interest. I think next to what we're seeing as they expand this footprint is the maritime pressure they're putting on the Strait of Hormuz. Because as Admiral Crocker pointed out, 20% of the global production goes through that strait, but it doesn't just stop there. We have supply chains, food, other economic resources that push through that strait that are going to start affecting the consumers that are on the other side of the strait. And I think we'll continue to see that. And that's why Iran is pushing to continue to control that waterway. Next, I would think it would be the proxy networks. We discussed briefly about Hezbollah, which is working effectively to continue to disrupt inside Lebanon and put pressure on our LAF partners and the civilians at play inside Lebanon. What we haven't seen yet is involvement from the remaining two proxies, Hamas and the Houthis, which I think is wonderful. As we continue to see them stay out of the conflict, it's a positive sign that maybe these proxies are moving away from an Iran support base. The next one we see is the one that hasn't been on the media that much, and it's been cyber attacks. Iran is absolutely leveraging both their state actors and non-state actors in cyber attacks, not just against U.S. interests, but in interests in the Middle East. We've seen cyber attacks against agriculture. We've seen cyber attacks against medical infrastructure within the U.S., and that continues to move the focus away from inside Tehran. So I think if you look at all of these things together, missile launches across the region and outside of the region to Azerbaijan and Turkey. We look at the proxy activation, the disruption in the maritime shipping lanes for both oil and supply chains at large. This is what they're doing to coordinate their strategy at once to keep everyone distracted and to keep the focus off them. And I do think that as we continue to see this move forward, we're going to continue to try to see them sow that outside of the region. And I think we're seeing that in the global response. It's not just the 20% production that's being affected. We're seeing global players and boards release oil reserves across the world, in China, in Africa, in Europe. They're starting to focus on protecting what they have because they're worried about the extended conflict. And that's exactly what Iran is trying to accomplish.
Could I add just one brief point to Mary's excellent, very comprehensive laydown? And I think you have laid down what we're working on here at CSIS. We're looking at and trying to document Iran's horizontal escalation by broadening the scope of the conflict geographically, and its vertical escalation through all the different targets and tactics, mobilization of proxies, various kinds of targets that you laid down. But the one thing I just want to highlight, which happened in the last 24 hours, is Iran's threats against companies like NVIDIA, Google, Amazon Web Services, etc., whom they accuse of supporting the U.S. and Israel. But in effect, what that does is seek to puncture this vision that I think all of us are trying to lay down of how the Gulf has seen itself going forward. The economic diversification, heavily focused on AI, establishing the Gulf as a new hub for AI with data centers. We've seen 3 data centers hit over the last 12 days. And so I think it's important because I think to me this is emblematic of these clashing visions where Iran is really lashing out and I think saying to the world, if we are not going to be able to operate in this region, we're going to make it virtually impossible for others as well. And I think that is a very scary moment now for the region.
No, that's an excellent point, Mona. And I think, this morning we heard our first rather defiant public statement from the new supreme leader of Iran. And in that, he vowed to avenge the blood of martyrs and pursue an effective and regret-inducing defense. So how likely at this point do you think we are to see regime change and or civil war or an extended military campaign in Iran?
Well, let me just start by saying that Iran is the ultimate black box as far as the U.S. is concerned. It's arguably the most complex political culture in the Middle East. We have not had an on-the-ground presence since 1979. So our level of ignorance on the internal workings of Iran, particularly in a conflict situation, cannot be overestimated. That said, after 10 days of this, there are no signs of the Islamic Republic cracking in spite of the decapitation. We now have the son of the leader, and there's an irony here that since one of the claims to legitimacy for the Islamic Republic was dispensing with hereditary monarchies, the Shah and the son of the Shah. And now, of course, we have the son of the Ayatollah, an irony that I'm sure is not lost on Iranians. But again, there has been no mass rising. There has been no visible fragmentation of the security forces. The Iranians were, in a sense, ready for this, as I understand it, with the decentralized command and control authority down to the provincial and sub-provincial level. It's not all run from Tehran. They learned lessons too in the June 2025 campaign and are prepared for this one. So right now I would, and again, who knows, but I would not see regime change from within as a likely near-term possibility.
I have to agree with Admiral Crocker on this one. Long before the Iranians were Shia Muslims, they were Persians, and they have long since planned for how they respond to aggressions of this level. I think that their planning and their capabilities to extend and continue to find new leaders, should they be continue to be taken out with military action, will remain in place for quite some time. And I think general consensus is that a continued air campaign, if the goal is regime change, that is not going to be successful without boots on the ground, which hopefully we are not going to get to. So I personally don't see regime change in the cards for Iran. They're too embedded religiously, culturally, and politically to have that happen.
I fully concur with both of those judgments and would add that unfortunately, we may end up in a situation worse than what we had prior to the onset of conflict, in the sense of having a rump regime that is more defiant, that is potentially more tied to the IRGC. We have, as noted, Mojtaba Khamenei, who, by all accounts, has even closer ties to the IRGC, potentially more hardline. So you could see almost a hardened, more radical, more rigid, more difficult to engage, as difficult as its predecessor was, regime in Iran. And I think that is, yet again, one of the lessons about regime change in the Middle East, which I wish we would finally learn, is just how difficult and complex those undertakings are, and all of the many unforeseen consequences that often end up rolling out as a result.
Yeah, it's just to pile on a little more here. It's interesting to note that through an incredibly intense ground and air campaign in Gaza for 2 years, Hamas is still there. It tells you something about the resilience of even an under-resourced and under-armed foe. The enemy gets a vote. And that leads us, I think, to the overwhelming question, doesn't it, Jess? As my former colleague and current friend Dave Petraeus famously asked in Iraq, tell me how this ends. So I had posed that question to Mona and Mary, and of course would have a few thoughts on that myself.
Wow, never one for easy questions. Ambassador Crocker. I mean, I'll just jump in and start by saying I think that's precisely it is how difficult it is in this moment today to map out a clear trajectory for how this ends. That is precisely why, it raises the question of how we got here in the first place. I mean, unfortunately, we have not really seen a clear set of objectives laid down by the administration. The objectives have shifted from one day to the next, and sometimes from the president to others in his cabinet. And so, barring a clear set of objectives, it's very hard to understand then what the end game is, what the duration of this conflict is, etc. My own sense is that this is a Pandora's box that's been opened, and there are going to be all of these various second, third order effects that will continue to rumble through. And we're going to have to really, I guess, work very hard, in particular, certainly with Israel as our partner in this, but also with the Gulf countries, to think about what kinds of off-ramps can we even start to consider ultimately? What are those? And what is our preferred end state? And of course, perhaps more importantly, what is the region's preferred end state in all of this? And then I would echo back to what I said at the beginning, which is they are looking for a stable, prosperous, economically vibrant Middle East. I think it's just got a lot harder to get there as a result of this conflict. But that is, I think, the task ahead.
That's a really hard question, Ambassador Crocker. I just want to start off with that. But I do think that there are opportunities for an end. I think it's important for us to understand that this is a different type of conflict. This is not like our traditional wars that we've seen in the history books. This is not ground offensive with troops on the ground. This is a primarily air-based offensive at this time, and it's between the US, Israel, and Iran, but the people being involved in this conflict are going to remain after it finishes. So while what we've seen happening in the GCC, and we've talked about it earlier in the conversation, is that they are moving away from dependency on oil, and they are moving away from what I would consider to be historical traditional norms into a more globalized region, and Iran is not doing that. So they had that problem before this conflict began, and that problem will continue once it ends. So I think the end state we're going to see here is we're going to see the end of hostilities, whether it be via a ceasefire or the complete decimation of the Iranians' ability to defend themselves, because just looking at the numbers, the U.S. has the upper hand in amount of numbers, their ability to continue the campaign. So I think those are our two possible end states. Is we're going to see a ceasefire, which with the rhetoric we're currently seeing, I don't see that in the cards anytime soon, but that could change, or we're just going to see them run out of their ability to defend themselves militarily.
Well, having rolled this grenade into the room, will now do my best to kick it out. I think the critical factor in an end is the United States, and it is President Trump in particular. I've come to a working hypothesis over the past year that what the president says should be taken seriously, but not always literally. And I think he's been of course, accused of being all over the map on what U.S. objectives are and what the reasons were for starting this conflict. But that also gives him the flexibility to set the terms for ending it. And it is clear he does not intend to put U.S. boots on the ground in any substantial number. If he were even contemplating that, we would have seen the signs long, long ago of the logistical and other preparations necessary for a major ground offensive. We don't see those. And I would be beyond astounded if he were even to contemplate such a thing. And that said, that leaves agency in the hands of Iranians. And as I said earlier, I don't think an imminent regime change or outbreak of civil conflict is in the offing. So what does that leave you? Well, I think that at the same time that President Trump has been said to have given Prime Minister Netanyahu unprecedented freedom of action, whether it is in Gaza, in Lebanon, or Iran, he also has unprecedented influence over him. And we saw that actually in the June 2025 conflict when President Trump decided it was time to bring a halt to that and literally persuaded Prime Minister Netanyahu to turn back attacking Israeli aircraft so the ceasefire could go into effect. So at a certain point, and both actions on the ground, in the water, and over the airwaves with the rhetoric, as you suggest, Mary, does not indicate that we are at that point yet. We may get to the point where Iran could be persuaded tacitly to cease fire. The U.S. could claim mission accomplished. They might want to choose a different formula. I remember that from May of 2003 with George W. Bush. And Israel could be reluctantly persuaded to accept it. Because I do think Israeli and U.S. strategic objectives are differing here. We can get into that if you're interested in the Q&A. But the enemy has a vote, and ultimately it would depend on whether Iran is willing to claim the survival of the regime, the damage it's inflicted, as sufficient to declare victory and ceasefire. That would remain to be seen. I think they could be persuaded. But ultimately, of course, it solves nothing, just as June 2025 solved nothing. And what we've seen with the attack on the Iraqi tankers, all it takes is a couple of guys in a speedboat with explosives. And those same couple of guys, in addition to striking tankers, can dump mines out of those speedboats in the Straits of Hormuz. If they have the will to continue, it's going to be very hard to break that will.
Excellent point, Ambassador. Thank you for that. Noting the time, I'm going to turn to Q&A to answer some of the questions that have come in for a few minutes. The first question that came in is, can you please discuss how the war in Iran will impact Ukraine's fight for independence against Russia?
Who wants to tackle that one?
I mean, I can jump in for 1 second as the, I don't know what I was going to say, instant expert, which I'm not on this, but I think what has become clear is that Russia has emerged really with a lot of upside from this conflict. Certainly the increase in oil prices are redounding to Russia's benefit. The fact that defensive munitions to deal with drones and missiles are being more flowed into the Middle East rather than to Ukraine. And the fact that so much of the world's attention is now focused on this conflict in the Middle East. To my mind, all of those things seem to add up to Russia being in a more powerful position on that conflict. And unfortunately, I think putting Ukraine in a more difficult position, at least in the short term. But I'd be interested to hear what colleagues have to say.
Oh, go ahead, Ambassador. I apologize.
No, I'll be brief since I have never been to Ukraine or to Russia for that matter. In fact, I can't go to Russia. I'm on their banned list. I'm proud of that. There are, I think Mona has summed up the downsides here. They are material. I think unlikely to see the release of the long-range ballistic missiles that Ukraine has been seeking as we continue to expend them in the Gulf. It may affect European supplies as well, since we supply the Europeans, and it may further increase a general anti-war sentiment in the United States, anti-anyone's war, all of which would play to Russia's advantage and to Ukraine's disadvantage. But all of that said, the Ukrainian tenacity is just extraordinary. I remember in the early days of this war, in February of 2024, we evacuated our embassy in Kyiv because we thought the Russians would be there the day after tomorrow. Well, 2 years later, they are nowhere near Kyiv. So again, the tenacity of the Ukrainians to fight on and to fight successfully, to continue to extract costs and casualties from Russia cannot be underestimated. But that said, I don't think anything in this current conflict favors Ukraine.
I would like to say that I think that Russia is happily taking a part from the Iranian playbook. This is a distraction for them from the combat in Ukraine and their conflict, but I don't think it changes the battle space all that much. I think things will continue in Ukraine and Russia as they currently are. I would like to highlight a nuance that I think is important, which is what we are seeing is the Ukrainians in the middle of their battle against the Russians stepping up and offering assistance to the Middle East in combating drones and their impact on the region to the tune of They are sending experts right now to the Middle East, to Jordan, to Saudi Arabia, and I believe to Qatar, Bahrain, to help in the counter-drone offensive. And that just speaks just to what the ambassador said, the tenacity of them as a people and their willingness to help others while still trying to combat the Russian onslaught. So credit to them to continuing to try to help others in the middle of this.
That's an excellent point. Thanks, Mary. One other question. I think we have time for one more. So the U.S. will disengage militarily from this conflict at some point. What do you all see as the gaps or opportunities for non-governmental actors to assist now that there are fewer assistance tools in the U.S. government toolkit?
I think this
Mona, as a USAID veteran, would you care to speak to that?
Well, I was mulling in my head, Ambassador, exactly what to say. I mean, look, I do think it is a real liability for the U.S. to have dismantled USAID at this moment. But that being said, I do think organizations like Spirit of America that find creative ways to engage on the ground, as I think you noted, Jess. I'm not as familiar, obviously, that you don't use they don't take government assistance. So finding organizations, NGOs, and others, and I would say also, quite frankly, diaspora groups who can play a very important role by virtue of their cultural and emotional ties and often their resources. And at the end of the day, I do think that the private sector and other stakeholders have always had an important role to play, and one that we probably haven't acknowledged or understood well enough. Now, I think going forward, by virtue of there being fewer options, this is the moment to see these other non-traditional stakeholders, whether they be diaspora or private sector companies and others who may have a vested interest, I would argue who should have a vested interest in seeing a stable and ultimately prosperous Middle East play a role. And last point I'll say, I was in Syria myself as well in November, and it was fascinating to see how they are looking at an investment-led approach to reconstruction. And I thought, well, that rings true. That sounds like exactly the way to be thinking about this.
It's a great point, Mona, and a great question generally. Spirit of America is unique, absolutely unique in the NGO space, because we are, first, we'll go where the hard stuff needs to be done, be it Lebanon or Ukraine, for example, or Iraq. But also we align ourselves carefully with administration priorities, whatever the administration. And that provides a complementarity that no other NGO can offer. And we've seen this again uniquely in Lebanon with our support for the Lebanese armed forces, closely aligned with U.S. government support for those armed forces. I understand, Mary, and I know you could speak to this, that we're looking at opportunities in Syria, where, as Mona notes, they are trying against enormous odds to develop a very different Syrian state than any state that has come before. Investment-led, private sector opportunity, and so forth. Capacity is their biggest challenge. And, again, I lament the passing of USAID for a lot of reasons, but Syria specifically, what they want to do is learn how to do stuff. And USAID's OTI, of course, was unique, Office of Transition Initiatives, was uniquely equipped to do that, as Mona knows. So we have
and Jess, I have to say, who worked with OTI on Syria. So yes,
so we've kind of unilaterally disarmed ourselves in an ongoing set of global challenges. And for the interim, until we sort this out, what our role in the world is, I think there is both an opportunity and a real need for Spirit of America to step forward.
Oh. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate you joining us for this timely and very important conversation today. To the audience, we're grateful for your interest in this conversation and for being a part of our community that cares deeply and is informed about practical engagement, and impact. If you'd like to stay connected with Spirit of America and see more about our work, please visit our website at spiritofamerica.org. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jess.